Well, hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Determinate content. Today it's our great pleasure to have Mark Jago as our guest. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Nottingham University. And he's the author of many articles and books, including Impossible Worlds and What Truth Is, which we'll be discussing today. And you could say that he's specializing in metaphysics, truth, and philosophical logic. Would you say that's kind of correct?
That's pretty much got it, yeah.
And he's also a fellow YouTuber with his channel Attic Philosophy, and he's in his attic right now doing philosophy.
I'm in the attic, yeah.
Which is a great channel that you should go check out. But today we're discussing his book, What Truth Is, which is a really good book. But before we get into that, I just wanted to start off by asking the most kind of difficult warm-up question ever. But this is like, how did you get into philosophy, and why is it a worthwhile pursuit?
Two good questions. Yeah. And I guess they don't always, go together. Like why it was good for me is not always why it's going to be good for everyone. But for me, I got into philosophy mostly because at school at A level, so 16 to 18, I kind of wasn't sure what to do, and back then the way school was organised, it was like, do you want to pursue sciences exclusively or like the arts, like English and languages exclusively? You had to choose. I didn't really know. But a new teacher came along, and she was into good music, and she we talked, and she suggested, well, there's this thing called philosophy. And I had no idea that really there was such a subject, that you could study it at a university, but it sounded good. I read some books, I applied, and I started doing philosophy undergraduate, and it really suited me. The way that it kind of allows you to really think about anything. Like, you can think about the arts, you can think about the sciences, you can think about society, you can think about yourself, whatever. But as long as you think about anything that's important in a really kind of, systematic and deep way, it counts as philosophy. And that, it turned out that suited me. Why is philosophy valuable, in general, not just for me? I think there's different answers you can give here, and it sort of depends what your there's different values to philosophy. So one is that as in learning philosophy, you train yourself to think clearly about things. So even if you study a philosophy degree, then you go away and do very little philosophy after that, but you've learned how to think clearly, you'll make better decisions in your life. You might have better political views. You might vote in a way that suits you and your family and your friends better. You might make better decisions about how you live your life, how you organize things around you. So pragmatically, it's very good. But I also think there's an intrinsic value to philosophy, to thinking about what it is to be human, how to live a good life, what the world is like, kind of with humans in it, and also, without humans in it. Thinking through how things work and what constitutes truth and meaning and stuff like that. Thinking through those questions, I think it's intrinsically valuable, as well as having this kind of pragmatic value of clear thinking.
Yeah, and am I right that you did a PhD in computer science at Nottingham, or did you do a joint degree in computer science and philosophy, or how did that work?
So I did my undergrad in philosophy. So just bog standard art subject, and I loved it. But towards the end of it, I was again like, I'm not really sure how I want to. There's this sense that philosophy, you study it for 3 years undergrad, and I wasn't quite sure where it was going. I was thinking, like, do I want to do another 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever years of the same? I was looking at some friends who had done, science degrees. They seemed to have a lot more under their belt, as it were. They sort of, it's not like they'd achieved more, but it's like they had maybe more practical skills. They were going off getting jobs and stuff. And I kind of saw the attraction of doing more scientific learning. And often the parts of the philosophy degree I really liked were the technical side, so learning about logic, learning about philosophy of maths, And more and more I kind of gravitated towards that kind of philosophy. It's not always easy to go and do that at master's level, studying that at PhD level in the UK. I mean, it is now, but maybe 20 years ago it wasn't quite so easy. So I ended up working with some logicians who just happened to be in the computer science department. So it wasn't so much that I was, really, really into computer science. It was like I wanted to do more logic. And at the time, that's where the logicians were. So yeah, I ended up doing PhD in computer science, but I kind of kept going in philosophy. I did a bit of teaching, seminar teaching in the philosophy department, which kind of, kept me in there, sort of thing.
And I mean, you've also done a lot of work on like the logic of truth making, which we'll come to later, and kind of exact truth making and so on. Do you think that your logical interest or your interest in computer science led you to like think about truth and truth making and so on, or did that come from another place?
So I was always interested in logic. I really enjoy that way of thinking through things. And so I guess what when you have that kind of training, what you end up doing is you end up approaching any philosophical topic, concept you look at with that kind of logic hat on as well. You kind of look at some problems and you think, okay, what kind of logic stuff can I do here? So it wasn't that I came at truth and truth making because of a logic background. It was more that when I saw these questions about truth and truth making being discussed, and lots of this stuff on truth making was being discussed a lot around Nottingham and other places that I'd go to, when I was an undergrad. So the philosophy department at the time had a whole bunch of people working on truth making. And I was very lucky that in maybe 2007 or something like that, I was teaching philosophy at Nottingham, and David Armstrong came for 6 months to teach. And we ended up teaching a course together, a postgraduate course on truth and truth making, obviously. So that kind of experience, these questions were floating around, and very much with a kind of a metaphysics flavour. All the questions were posed in a metaphysical way. What is the metaphysics of truth and truth making? David Armstrong and states of affairs and everything. But I also started thinking about them with a kind of a logic hat on. Like, what is the kind of logic of these notions, particularly the logic of truth making, which I think those guys at least hadn't really thought so much about them. I mean, it turns out other people had, but I didn't know about that at the time. So, it felt like quite an exciting, new way of approaching a topic.
Yeah. And what I really liked about your book is that it talks about the metaphysics, but it also talks about like the logic of truth and the paradoxes. And ultimately, your account of truth is sort of motivated by a solution to the paradoxes. But we will get to that soon.
Yeah,
but
we'll get to that, right.
Yeah, right. But I guess you could say that if we go to your book now, like a fundamental claim of the book is that the property of being true is identical to the property of being made true in the truth-making sense. So could you just give like, what does this mean? Could you give like a short pitch to this?
Yeah, good question. So I guess one way of getting across this is, you think of traditional theories of truth, and you've more or less got, on one hand, the kind of realist correspondence theory that to be true, a sentence or a proposition or whatever has to, in some way, correspond with the world or with some fact in the world, some state of affairs in the world. And then, in contrast, you have all the other theories of truth, so epistemic theories, minimalist theories, deflationist theories, pragmatist theories, and correspondence theory has a lot of problems, and a lot of people thought of truth making, which was something that was discussed an awful lot in metaphysics. I guess the early decades of this century. People thought that as kind of like a successor to the correspondence theory of truth, in some ways, but not many people took it to be a theory of truth. Right, so people. I mean, even David Armstrong, sort of, the most kind of gung-ho truth-making theorist of the lot, didn't really take it to be a theory of how we understand what truth is. He just thought that given what truth is, it requires there to be a truth maker. And my idea was, well, when we're talking about things like the pragmatic theory of truth or the correspondence theory of truth, we're really trying to understand what truth is, like what the concept or what the property of truth is. Why not use all of this stuff that people have worked out about truth making to try to provide an answer to the old philosophical question of what truth is? So, that answer, put nice and simply, would be, to be true is to have a truth maker. And it's not just that they line up, it's that, they are the same property. So to be true, the nature of being true is just given by standing in this relation to a fact in the world.
Right, yeah. I guess like a standard problem for like all theories of truth is like this thought that you will just inevitably end up in a treadmill, because you have to use the concept true in order to explain what it is, or to say that any definition of it is true. I was wondering if there's like a similar worry here, that like if you're not just saying that these two properties are coextensive but are identical, then if I'm wondering like what is true, and you say, well, to be true is to be made true, and then I ask again, well, what is it to be made true? Would the response be like, it is made to be made true or something? And then we just go on, and I would never learn what truth is, because it's baked into the definition.
So you get this kind of regress of
yeah.
I mean, that sounds similar to this issue that Frege had. That Frege thought that truth is completely undefinable, indefinable, because suppose you give any account of something and then you say, well, is it true? Okay, so you just you're asking what true is, and then you give your account, and then you say, well, is that true? And then it's true that thing's true, and it's true that the explanation of that is true. And you seem to get this regress. But that's never bothered me, in the sense that, sure, you can say of anything, any truth theory you say, you assert it, and then you say, well, it's true. So it's true that it's true. But it's not a vicious regress. So, a kind of, when you have an equivalence between A and A is true, you're always going to get this issue that for any A it's true, and it's true that it's true, and it's true that it's true. But that doesn't necessarily give you a vicious regress. And I think you can say a sort of a similar thing in the case of truth and truth making. But one difference here is I think if you're thinking about it in a definitional way, like defining truth in terms of truth making, you don't want to understand truth making as sort of truth plus making, as in you're taking the truth bit and you add the making as the extra ingredient, because then you can say, well, what's truth making? Oh, maybe it's making truth making, and you always get this kind of regress of making. The way I would prefer to think about it is it's not truth making, it's truth making. So there is this one concept. We first understand that, or rather we first, if we're telling a metaphysical story, that's where we start. And then we define truth in terms of that.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, part of the worry here that I guess you've got is, conceptually speaking, can we really understand truth making without truth? Probably not. So the metaphysical story and the conceptual story, the way we understand these things, might not always run in lockstep.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah, no, I wasn't quite thinking about the concept. Although Frege, I think he was thinking about how do we come to learn what truth is if we don't have the concept truth, and that just seems impossible. But what I was thinking more here about is whether if you can identify the properties, given that you have to, that truth seems to be involved in the property of being made true. But if you take made true to be in some sense a unified property in some way, maybe you can get around it. That's interesting.
So, I mean, one way of going, maybe this is not the best way, but one way of going would be you just take truth making to be something like a metaphysical primitive.
Yes.
And then truth is defined in terms of it. So you don't want to define the metaphysical property of truth making in terms of truth.
Yeah.
But to understand, to get some kind of conceptual grip on what property it is, or what relation it is, you're going to bring in the concept of truth at some point.
Yeah, right. And that's, I mean, to go on to another thing you discuss just in the start of the book, like you differentiate between giving an account of truth, the property of truth, and giving an account of the concept truth, or even giving an account of the word truth as we use it in English, and you kind of separate your approach from a more kind of conceptual or linguistic approach. Your approach is metaphysical. Could you say something about maybe tying on to this problem that Frege had, maybe? But could you say something about what you regard as the pitfalls of the latter two approaches?
Right. Yeah. So I guess any time you're analysing some notion, you've got the concept, you got the word, you got the property. Often it doesn't make a difference. Often philosophers just use, concept and property to mean the same thing. The word is often interchangeable with the concept and the property.
Yeah.
They do come apart. So think about water. There's the stuff. There's the concept. There's the word. Strictly speaking, the word could have meant something completely different. There's no necessity in water meaning water. The concept of water that we've got is probably like wet stuff. The property is, H2O or mostly H2O, or it's, so it's the property is like something that we know a posteriori, right? The concept is something that we have a priori access to. They're gonna run together, but if we start thinking about their modal profile, if we're going to start thinking about the epistemology, like how do we know about water? Well, the way we know about water is different from the way we know about the concepts. Conceptual truths might be great for analysing the concept we've got, but conceptual truths aren't so good about analysing the property. And I think the same goes with other stuff, right? So it's the same with truth. If you're thinking about the concept of truth, conceptual truths, the conceptual role it plays might get you a certain way, right? So we're thinking about truth in terms of the T scheme. So, if A is true, then A, for any proposition or truth bearer A, truth is valuable, truth in some way corresponds to the world. These are all, I guess, conceptual truths about truth. And if you're a deflationist, you're going to say that's all there is. But for other theories, there's more to truth than just that.
Yeah.
So for most theories of truth, what truth is going to go beyond, I think it's going to go beyond just what the conceptual truths tell us.
Yeah, that's interesting. But although I would like to, because the situation here seems a little bit different from the case of water, right? Because you're in your book and in treatises on truth, you're not really kind of doing some kind of empirical or a posteriori work. Unless you take a very broad definition of what that is. So what would you say, like?
Yeah, but I think it's still going to be. So in this case, what the chemistry does for water, I guess the metaphysics does for truth. And you might think, metaphysics is largely conceptual in a broad sense, but it's still, as it were, going beyond the conceptual truths specifically about truth. It's bringing in other metaphysical considerations.
Yeah. Yeah, so another question, like kind of adjacent to that, it feels like there's a lot of kind of a metaphysics first turn in the literature now, that people say, I'm not investigating, the concept of knowledge. I'm investigating knowledge, or like I'm not investigating, this word, but I'm investigating the thing. But there seems to be this kind of thing that, like, from the linguistic turn, that there's something right about it, that when we're asking what knowledge is, or when we're asking what truth is, we have to use the concept knowledge or true. Certainly we don't have to mention it, but we have to use it. And it seems to me in some cases it's a bit maybe kind of non-critical. It's a non-critical view to kind of, in the philosophical sense of like critical philosophy, that you're not inspecting the concepts, but you think that they you take it for granted that they may like get to the heart of the thing Do you see what my kind of worry here?
So I think it's a kind of a balancing act, right? We don't get direct access to the metaphysical structure of the world. It's not like, you can just sort of say, oh, that thing there, that's the causation relation, that's the grounding relation. I've seen it. I know what it looks like. Yeah. On the other hand, during the linguistic turn, people express that differently. Some took it to mean we only look at language. Others took it to mean we look at the world, but we always look at the world through language. And it's true that we never get to think about the world except through our concepts of the world. I mean, that's just, it's just trivially true that we can't think without using the concepts that we've got. And in the case of something like truth or knowledge, we're largely interested in the actual concept we've got, because it might be, life would be easier if the job was to analyze something that lined up with justified true belief or whatever, right? But unfortunately for us, or for people who want to analyze knowledge, there's Gettier examples. So the concept that we actually have of knowledge is just really, really tricky. So we're kind of, in some way, in that case, we're a bit hamstrung. In the case of truth, we've got this completely simple concept that's really important to us. And if we started analysing something, so I suppose you sort of thought, we've got this problem of the liar paradox, but we can get around it just by getting rid of some of the logic of truth, like forget the rule that takes us from P is true to P. Oh, great! We've solved the liar we've solved the paradoxes. The problem is, it was the concept of truth that we were interested in, and that's conceptually it seems to require certain rules. We're absolutely stuck with the concepts that we've got. Whether that means that investigation should proceed purely in terms of conceptual truths about them. That's not my view. My view is that we have to have we have a bunch of conceptual truths that we'd like to incorporate as largely as possible. I think in the case of truth, they're very much mandated. You can't sort of just chuck out what seems to be conceptual truths. But we have a bunch of other stuff that we can use. We've got general practice in metaphysics. We've got the way that theory ties in with other theories. Yeah. That's how we build a metaphysical theory. Often we're going to use a lot of the methodology that we use in the sciences, where we've got empirical evidence that kind of keeps us honest. We don't have so much of that in metaphysics, but we still have this idea of what counts as good theory building. And I think that does allow us to go just beyond investigating conceptual truths or linguistic truths or whatever.
Yeah, and do you think that methodology is kind of what hope do we have to think that this methodology of kind of assessing virtues and like relative simplicity versus explanatory power, sort of that it gets towards the property truth? Because at least like I found that the linguistic turn people, they could at least say like we're just investigating our concept, so like we're not even caring about the thing out there, but here we're doing something more. So we want to know what the property is.
Yeah. So. That's a good question. So there's a general question about what guarantee do we have that investigating things in line with theoretical virtue, so trying to keep theories coherent and simple. Why do we think that actually gets us to the truth? I mean, that's a general question. Yeah. It's also a question for science, right? Why do we think that the simplest scientific theory, even if it kind of is backed up by empirical evidence, is more likely to be true, when there's this other kind of completely crazy theory that nevertheless respects all the evidence? So there's a general question there. But I think there's a specific issue for the way we're doing philosophy, along the lines of sorry, I completely forgot what the last thing that you said something at the end there that I thought was really interesting, and it's just escaped my mind.
Might it be like some general skepticism or something?
Right, yeah. It's just completely skipped. There was something I thought that was sort of specific about the way that we. So not these general worries about. Oh yeah, right. So we've got general worries about theoretical virtues, but I guess there's also a specific question about the relationship between the concepts we have and the things in the world, like let's say the properties. So one way of thinking about the relationship between concepts and properties is on the model of the relationship between a name and an individual, right? So, or a description and an individual. So somehow, some kind of information or content that we've got in linguistic terms or in mental items, in concepts or whatever, picks out stuff in the world. You can make an assumption that language or thoughts have content, that they're meaningful, and you can make an assumption that meaning, that content somehow consists in stuff in the world or possible, bits of the world or whatever. And if that's your general explanation of meaning or content, plus you make the assumption that this talk about this particular concept, truth or knowledge or whatever, is meaningful, how's that going to be? Well, it must be that the concept bears some kind of relationship to the sort of stuff that we're talking about in the world. If it was just completely free-floating, it seems hard to understand how it gets to have any kind of meaning or content.
Yes, right. Yeah. So I mean,
so that's all premised on a broadly speaking realist approach to meaning and content, which could be questioned.
Yeah.
But,
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not going that way. I was just kind of thinking that maybe in this metaphysics first approach, maybe you could grant that we're not talking about the concept truth, but maybe saying that we're talking about truth or we're talking about knowledge. Maybe that's kind of setting aside, some kind of conceptualist worries or something like that. But I think we those are very general problems. It's not, and as you say, it's a problem for science as well. So, but it was just a thought that I had. So, I guess we could go on to discuss if you do take this this line that we are trying to investigate truth as a property. We investigate the property of truth, right? Then you have a lot of enemies because, as you put it in the book, there are two complete different ways of approaching the problem of truth. So substantive theories of truth, like the ones you mentioned before, like pragmatism, correspondence, coherence, all these classic ones. And then there's non-substantive theories of truth. So we can start with the non-substantive ones. So what do you think? What is the characterization of that sort of branch of?
So I guess for a non-substantive truth, I guess we're in the region of deflationism or any kind of approach that tries to say there's really, metaphysically speaking anyway, there's really nothing to truth, really beyond just the platitudes or beyond very, very minimal principles. So you might take them to be just the T scheme, right? So for any sentence or proposition or whatever, P is true just in case P. And deflationists typically say that's all there is to truth. Disquotationalists would say all there is to truth is sentence A is true if and only if A. And there's a whole bunch of different variants in this area, but they're all along the lines of there's this central principle to truth based around the T schema or something similar. And once you've got that down, that's it. There's really very little else to say. And in particular, there's no further metaphysical question about why the T scheme's true or what property truth is. So some would say, there's no property of truth, or maybe truth is just a logical property, or it's just a device for disquotation, or it allows you to make generalizations like, everything Stephen Fry says is true, that kind of thing. But there's no spooky metaphysics. There's no, anything that sort of says truth is insert some kind of heavy-duty metaphysical, correspondence relation or epistemic, coherence relation or something like that. There's none of that business going on.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose there's a similar, as you talked about, there's the word and the concept. There's a similar kind of difference between like a sentence and a proposition.
Right. Yeah,
and you start by looking at like sentence-based theory. It's the non-substantive theories of truth, starting with sentences. And the problem that you find in the book is that they ultimately are not able to characterize truth at all, but they're just able to characterize truth in a context in order to handle problems with like indexicals and such. Would you say that's kind of your main worry with
I mean, it's so. I think it's natural to start with that way of formulating a sort of a disquotational theory of truth. I think historically, that's the way these things came about. It's very, very natural to think of talking about when a sentence is true, and it just gets tricky because we've always got the context of the sentence plus our own context in saying whether or not it's true. So it's just naively applying the T schema, we're going to get I'm sitting is true just in case I'm sitting, but that's, if you think about how those two sentences work, it's not going to be true because in asserting that, I'm saying I'm sitting is true just in case Mark Jago is sitting, but obviously that's not true. I'm sitting can be true of you, it can be true of anyone, irrespective of what I'm doing. So we always have to tie truth down, the truth of a sentence down to a context. I mean, that's not. I don't think that's a problem. Okay. Whenever we do linguistics, whenever we're trying to evaluate sentences, you need to tie it all down to a context. I mean, once you've got sentences in a context, you've got something that is already a little bit more like a proposition.
Yeah,
it's something a little bit more metaphysical. It's no longer purely a linguistic item. You've got, I mean, first of all, we have to pin the sentence down to its meaning, right? So we're not just talking about a string of sentences, a string of symbols. We're talking about, syntax plus meaning plus extra linguistic context like times and places and worlds and all this stuff. So you've got something a lot more substantial already. All of that stuff, when you bundle it together, looks a little bit more like a proposition than where we started.
Right. Yeah.
But I think you can get, you can formulate a perfectly good form of the T scheme or deflationism or whatever in this way. I think my main worry with focusing on the sentences as the only bearers of truth is that just seems to me that there's more truths, more things that we might want to say are truths, depending on what you think sentences are. I mean, if sentences are, I mean, just take an easy case, right? Suppose sentences are utterances that came about with human beings. So, wind back to when there were no human beings. It was true that there were no human beings.
Yeah.
But also no utterances. So, no. So,
yeah.
Obviously, we can make utterances describing that as being true. But I think it's true to say there would have been truths back then when there were no utterances.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sentences are not going to be okay. Let's grant that it's not going to work as characterizing truth because there are more truths than there are sentences or utterances. So then let's turn to this, we go out to propositions and you characterize different views of what propositions are and so on. But I would like to ask about one of your criticisms of this view, which I thought was really interesting. And this is the sort of problem that if we take the T scheme, I say the T schema, but you say the T scheme. I don't know what's right. I always thought it was the T schema, but yeah. Doesn't matter. But
I don't know what the difference is.
Yeah,
I mean, schema.
It's the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Potato. Yeah. I'm gonna say the T schema. So the T schema, the proposition that P is true if and only if P. That seems to, on a deflationary view, to characterize what truth is, right? Or at least maybe what the concept true is. I don't know. But let's say now, for simplicity, I characterize what truth is. But then the problem is that this seems to say that truth does not have like an antecedently determined identity. This object that figures in this proposition doesn't have any antecedently defined identity before the propositions of that type are true, before we grant that all of them are true, which would seem to lead in a kind of a vicious circle where the content of those propositions are determined by the objects that figure in them, including truth, but truth is determined by the way they figure in those types of propositions. Would you say that's the kind of a right way to characterize your worry about?
I think so, yeah. And there's a lot of assumptions going on there. So it depends on what we mean by proposition, and it depends on how we think of the you know. So firstly, we need a notion of a proposition that has like they have objects and properties as constituents. So that, you know, propositions in this sense aren't going to be sentences. They're not going to be sets of possible worlds. They're going to be like Russellian kind of tuples. And they're going to contain, so, you know, the proposition that I'm sitting would be some kind of entity that somehow contains me and the property of sitting. Suppose that's what your notion of a proposition is, and suppose you're expressing your theory of truth in terms of T propositions. The truth is fixed by the T scheme, and the T scheme is a bunch of propositions of the form P is true if and only if P. And the thought was, yeah, there is a kind of a circularity there, because to say what truth is, we have to say what the propositions are. Like, if we missed out one proposition, if we missed out the proposition that, you know, Mark is sitting if and only if the proposition that Mark is sitting is true, if we missed out that proposition, or if we had some more propositions in there, like Mark is sitting if and only if it's sunny, we wouldn't determine the right property for truth. We would determine some weird property. So we got to get the propositions right. But those propositions are determined by what constituents they have, right? So the proposition that Mark is sitting is determined by me, my identity, and the identity of the property of sitting. As it were, you know, if my identity changes, the identity of the proposition that I'm sitting changes. And then the problem is that the propositions in question involve the property of truth. So we've got truth depending on the propositions, and propositions depending on the properties they involve, including the property of truth. So there's a kind of a determination, you know, this idea that it's not meant to be a conceptual problem. Which one do we conceptually get a grip on first? It's meant to be a kind of a metaphysical issue. The identities of these things seems to be got in a kind of a vicious circle. Yeah.
I thought that was interesting, and it kind of, because when I read that, I was thinking back on like Wittgenstein and the Tractatus, and I think I found out that I had the wrong interpretation all along, because I went to look at it again on the basis of your book, but I think I was wrong. But my first interpretation when I read it was that he thought that like you know, the world is a totality of facts, not things, and that facts determine the nature of things. So like the fact that I can occur in, like Åke can occur in a fact like Åke is holding a cup, makes it true that, or, you know, if you want to speak that way, makes it true that, you know, my essence allows that. But the fact that I cannot occur in a proposition like Åke is a prime number kind of excludes that proposition, so that you start with facts first, and then the nature of the things kind of follow from it. But I think I was actually wrong about that, but there's a complete separate discussion. But anyways, the question is, do you think that there could be something like holistic going on, that maybe like truth is determined by the facts that it figures in, like the propositions, and those facts are also determined by what truth is, but that there's like a kind of there's a joint determination relation going on. That there's it's not as if truth comes first in being determined, and it's not as if the range of the set of the T propositions come first, but that they kind of together determine what truth is and also what the T propositions are, or something like that. I don't know.
I mean, this is. I think whenever you have a kind of a circularity objection, one possible response is that there's a kind of a mutual determination thing going on. So that is always an option. I think just to jump in there actually on the Tractatus on Wittgenstein. The question is absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, there's a question of interpretation. Did Wittgenstein really think in a facts first way? Did he think in an objects first? Because at some point he says like the facts are objects it's like links in a chain. So he talks about facts being made up of objects standing in relation. So it's unclear which come first, if that even makes sense. Yeah. There's an absolutely fascinating investigation of can you do metaphysics in a fact-first way from, I think it's called The Facts in Logical Space, Jason Turner, where he basically says, right, we start off the metaphysics with the facts, and then we see if we can recreate individuals and properties and stuff from, I mean, it's just amazing work. So,
you got to check that out.
Everyone should go and check that out. Yeah. Right. Back to the issue of truth and mutual determination. I mean, I suppose you could... It's always a subtle issue, I think, when you're talking about, mutual determination, whether, if these two things are going to mutually determine one another, what's the difference between that working and just nothing getting determined? I mean, just, outright circularity. I think it's a real subtle issue of how you can make it work. I think if you did want to say that the truths and the facts are just mutually determined, but possibly a better way to express that would be just like something like an identity theory of truth, right? That really the truths are just the facts. I mean that's kind of like the classic identity theory of truth, that the truth and, as it were, what makes them true. Then there's not these two separate things with a relation between them or anything like that. It's just,
Right. Yeah, because I guess you could say that, in addition to this, so you started with the word and the concept and the property, there's also the sentence and the proposition and the fact. And on this view, propositions and facts would be, or at least true propositions and facts would be completely identical. Yeah,
right. And I mean that view has a lot of issues, like what are false propositions, what are false sentences, but it does have the advantage of getting over any kind of determination problems because you've got identity and you've got you have an explanation of a sort you've got the simplest explanation between the relationship between the world and truths, just identity. I mean, it's going to have issues with, you might think it's one of the conceptual truths of truth, the concept that the world determines the truths, right? Truths are true because the world is a certain way, but not vice versa, right? We don't say that the world is the way it is because certain things are true. It's very hard to get a kind of an asymmetric because talk out of identity.
Oh,
so that's a strong reason for thinking that we do have this kind of, we have these two phenomena. We have the world and we have the truths, and there's a one-way like determination relation from the world to the truths coming out there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I suppose we could go on to discuss the substantive theories, or at least one, because you discuss mainly pluralism and epistemic approaches, I think. And one thing this is a general question. So am I right in thinking that you really like the Fitch style reasoning? because you have written a paper about truth-making maximalism using this Fitch approach, and then another argument in this book also uses that. And here you just kind of say that like, so before we get into, could you say what the Fitch style problem for knowability approach to truth is, and why you think? Because you just say that's like ultimately just convincing, and there's nothing more to say about it. It's just perfect reasoning, and
So there's this argument that's variously called the Fitch paradox, or the knowability argument, or the Church Fitch reasoning. Lots of different names, and it's this idea that take as your assumption that truths are inherently knowable, right? If something's true, then it's possible to know it. It looks like you can logically derive from that every truth is in fact known. The reasoning is surprising, but it's quite short, and you just kind of say, well, let's imagine that there's a truth that isn't known. By assumption, you can know that truth, but then you would end up knowing both that this thing is true and that it's not true. Contradiction. Turns out that there's no unknown truth. But obviously there are unknown truths. I mean, hopefully we will find out, the human race will discover truths that we don't now know, like how to, treat Alzheimer's better, how to cure cancer or whatever. So it looks like there are unknowable truths. So if you think it's good reasoning, and if you think that it means what it seems that it means, you have an argument for a certain kind of realism here, that truth can, at least in theory, go beyond what humans or conscious creatures or whatever could know about. It's sometimes called a paradox because it seems like with such a small premise you get such a big conclusion. But I prefer to think of it as like, turns out, logic and philosophy has some, power after all, right? You can discover, using logic, using reasoning, you can discover interesting things about the world and about our knowledge of it.
Yeah, but I suppose because the initial thought with that, and I don't know enough about it, but it just seems that there has to be something weird about that. But you write that using different logics, non-classical logics, so you could derive the same thing.
I mean, people have said all kinds of things, either trying to prove what's wrong with the reasoning, or taking issues with various of the premises, or just some people have just said, look, I don't know what's wrong with it, but there must be something wrong with it. It's a paradox. And they treat it like the liar, right? We don't know what's wrong with the reasoning, but there must be something wrong with it. So don't believe in the conclusion.
Yeah.
I'm very much more in the kind of, this is a bit of reasoning that tells us something interesting about a concept. I mean, I think, this does happen in other areas, right? So, take something like incompleteness in mathematics, so the proof that you can't prove everything that's true in basic number theory. At one point, that was very much an open question. And through a bit of good reasoning, we learned something important about the concept of truth, about proof. That's a kind of a way in which the mathematical realm reaches out and stretches out beyond what we can know about it through purely, algorithmic proof theoretic means. And, so this logical proof tells us something about reality, mathematical reality in this case. And I think the Fitch reasoning is doing something similar.
Yeah, it's quite analogous in some way, because essentially I
think it is, yeah.
You're saying like there is this truth that in some sense cannot be derived from, or it's not knowable, in some sense can't be derived, I guess. And then you have that kind of problem.
I mean, they might even be, you might think they form some kind of collection of limits on human knowledge, in the sense that how do we know stuff? I mean, it's not going to be algorithmic in the strict sense of like, here are the rules that we can write down, but we know stuff by experiencing the world and processing that information in our brain. Our brain is, I mean, probably some kind of computer, right? So in some very, very broad sense, it's algorithmic. We get empirical inputs, we get sense data inputs, and we process them in some way. So, you might think there is some kind of relationship between what we can know and some kind of algorithmic notion. It's not like we have direct intuition into the way reality is, the way mathematical reality is. I guess. I mean, Gödel thought we did.
Well, speak for yourself.
I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it does raise some questions about those general philosophical questions. But I was also wondering just about the kind of logic of it and so on. But I guess we should actually now turn to truth-making, and because now we have so we've discussed the non-substantive theories. We've kind of concluded that they're not apt, and then you discussed the sort of substantive theories, mostly pluralism, and then like this epistemic version. But then we get to your favorite approach, which is the truth-maker approach. So I guess in the start you said that it's been seen as a kind of like successor to the correspondence theory. Would you say that like it is a sort of correspondence theory if you take states of affairs, or depending on exactly the formulation, but could it be just a correspondence theory?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of if the correspondence theory is just the idea that there are truth bearers, propositions or whatever, and then there are facts in the world and truth consists in the relationship or some kind of relationship between them, then it's a successor. It's just a better formulation of the correspondence theory. But I think there's a bunch of things that ended up getting built into the correspondence theory. The idea that, maybe it's a one-to-one correspondence. Maybe the idea, like an isomorphism, that there is a kind of a structural relationship between them. That goes in truth-maker theory. One fact can make a load of different truths true, and one truth can be made true by potentially lots of different facts on different occasions. The idea that it's inherently committed to realism. So, correspondence theory was always the example of a realist theory of truth, perhaps the only one, whereas pragmatism and coherence were sort of, non-realist theories. I mean, I don't think that truth-maker theory really has to be about realism.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, you mentioned, you had Jamin on the channel, and this is something that he's argued, right, that suppose you have an anti-realist theory about whatever, about morality or jokes or whatever. I mean, providing it gives you some kind of property of being funny or of being morally right, you can talk about truth-making. So it can be made to fit with kind of anti-realist approaches to certain subject matter. So
that's something that's very
it's quite in some ways it's quite a neutral theory, even though it's also quite metaphysically demanding.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, one thing that I thought was a kind of a big difference between them is that there's this kind of entity, like Socrates exists, is made true by Socrates. It's just like this individual thing. Whereas like maybe the correspondence theory wouldn't articulate it like that. Maybe it would say, Socrates exists is true just in case it kind of corresponds to some fact. But then the version that you kind of opt for is like the states of affairs approach. And in that sense, they do look very similar, although, you're right in that maybe there's like, not a one-to-one relation, and there are differences in whether it entails realism or not, and whatever. Yeah.
And I think you don't... there's always a debate about which entities do the truth-making, which entities do the grounding or whatever. And there's lots of different options that you can go for, on a truth-maker theory. So I think you could adopt this truth maker approach to truth, but have completely different views to me on how truth making works, what kind of entities do truth making. It's quite sort of, you can take some bits of the theory, but it doesn't mean you have to accept all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I just another general question about like skepticism. So before we started this podcast, I was saying that I had kind of gotten into a little bit truth making, being kind of interested in it from listening to all the skeptics of truth making. And I kind of think that truth making is asking about what makes a sentence true or a proposition true is kind of asking the wrong questions or something like that. It's kind of inviting a certain type of metaphysical speculation that we should steer clear of. But on the other hand, I wanted to hear what your thoughts are about that sort of suspicion towards the whole thing.
So I guess there's a sort of a gentle skepticism, which is that maybe it makes sense in some cases, but not in others. And then there, so for certain propositions about the past, about modality, about things not existing, it's going to be very hard to say what makes them true. But then there's the more radical skepticism that the whole notion just is barking up the wrong tree. And I think in a way, that's the much more interesting notion philosophically, because it relates to how we think about meaning and content, right? So it's focusing, it almost fits more in the kind of philosophy of language field as much as it does in metaphysics. So how do we think about the meaning of a thought or an expression, and how that relates us to the ways the world is? So, the realist, broadly speaking, the realist tradition in philosophy of language is always going to try to relate the meaning of an expression to ways the world could be, to its possible truth conditions or something like that. So very much the kind of thing you were talking about with, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, meaning being related to kind of possible states of affairs. And if you start going down that line, like linking content or meaning or whatever to states of affairs, you're already starting to invoke relationships between linguistic items and stuff in the world. And in particular, the kind of mediating relationship is truth, right? So it's not just random stuff in the world that we're shoving in there. It's the stuff that would be relevant to the truth of that sentence. So we're assuming that there is some kind of relationship, some kind of systematic relationship between the meaning of an expression and the ways in which it would be true. And so that's a broadly realist way of thinking about meaning. And once you start taking those steps, you're getting very, very close to something that looks like truth making.
Right.
Okay, you've got your linguistic expression. You've got a bunch of stuff down here that would make it, that's relevant to its truth. That's going to be linked to its meaning. It's not so far to get from that to, if this thing actually does exist, then it makes this linguistic expression true.
Yeah, and you've actually argued in other papers that truth making provides a kind of a good semantics for a lot of terms, because I suppose the worry with like a standard truth conditional approach is that like necessarily equivalent propositions can in some sense both figure as the truth condition for a sentence. So maybe like the classic promise, maybe they're not necessarily equivalent, but like snow is white and 2 + 2 = 4 can sort of be a truth condition for snow is white. And then you have the sort of worry that it's not relevant in some sense to the truth of snow is white. And if you think about the meaning or the content or the proposition just in terms of sets of possible worlds, you get some weird anomalous results. Content seems to be cut up way too coarsely. Yes. Often that's not a problem. Sometimes it is.
And it's certainly a feature that if you think about content, not in terms of possible worlds, but in terms of possible states of affairs, the kind of things we're thinking about as being potential possible truth makers. So in other words, you think about content not in terms of its truth conditions, but its truth maker conditions. Yeah. What would potentially make it true? I think you get almost for free there. You get a nicer account of content compared to other realist accounts like the possible worlds analysis. Yeah. That doesn't really touch the sort of the more anti-realist ways of thinking about content. So I think once you want to go down a broadly speaking realist route, the truth maker one is a nice one.
Yeah.
Whether that's a reason to go down the realist route in the first place is I mean part of the reason for thinking that is for wanting to go down a broadly speaking realist route is and I think this goes back to something Tim Williamson talks about sometimes. It's just the success, right? We know what a realist theory will look like, even if we don't have all the details. But for anti-realist theories, they've always seemed a lot more hand-wavy.
Yeah.
So, okay, suppose we take a sort of later Wittgenstein view of meaning and say meaning is use. Exactly what does that look like in terms of a semantic theory? Of the kind that we could take to the linguistics department and say, here's how we're going to formulate a theory of meaning. That's not an argument. That's just a sort of general. Here's some kind of reason for going one way,
right? But I suppose what I was trying to articulate was that you're saying if you have a broadly realist account of meaning, then truth makers kind of come on. But you even use truth makers or prefer truth makers in an account of meaning, and then if you do that, then it's gonna come inevitably.
I mean, sociologically, you get this thing that in philosophy, in any discipline, right? When you work with something, you start seeing that thing as a solution to everything. So after a couple of years of work, decade or something of working with thinking about truth makers, turns out they solve everything.
Yeah, exactly.
And they crop up in everything I write about.
They make your coffee in the morning. You just...
Now, there's definitely room for skepticism there in the sense that, what are the chances? I mean, if I'd picked some other concept in 2007 to work on, would I have thought that was the solution to everything? Who knows, right?
Who knows, yeah. I mean, I guess that's tying on to, the... Maybe not really, it doesn't tie on, but it's more kind of maybe tying on to the broader question of, philosophy, and that some concepts come into vogue and a lot of things are written about it, and then they kind of, after a while, they disappear, but then, maybe they come back again and so on. But
I thought that the truth-making literature had run its course back some time ago, I guess long before I started writing the book. It just seemed like everything that had been said about truth making had been said, the negative existential, but that was all very much from a metaphysical point of view. And I think in some ways what helps to sort of enliven a debate is to take it into different fields, right? So not just, what are the truth makers for, there are no hippos in the room, which definitely has been done to death, but how do we link this talk of truth making to talk of truth and of meaning, of semantics, of propositions, of logic, and I think once you start doing all that, you have a lot more to talk about, and the debate can become lively again.
Yeah, and I guess that's the sort of thing that's happening a lot with grounding now, that it's being applied to a bunch of things, and then people are kind of thinking about how it may help to elucidate certain, and I mean grounding is, as you mentioned, quite related to truth making, or maybe a truth making is a species of grounding. So but I want to turn now to the topics that have been what did you say, debated to death, about the hippos, not the non-existent hippos and that sort of stuff, because you advocate a pretty hardcore line, which I should say you have to advocate, right? Because you're saying that is true is, or the property being true is identical to the property being made true. But then it follows that all truths are made true, which is the truth maker maximalist line. So
Yeah.
what
and
is
it's a really difficult line to go down.
It's a difficult line to go down. But could you say, like, what is truth maker maximalism in more detail than I just did, and like what, and what are like the main kind of considerations there?
Well, yeah, I mean, really, you nailed it, right? Every truth is going to have a truth maker. So there's got to be some entity, some real thing that exists in the world that makes it true that there's no hippo in the room with me right now. And most people think that the relationship between a truth maker and a proposition is a necessary one. So it doesn't just happen to make it true by luck or whatever, but it's necessarily the case that if that thing exists, the proposition is true. So there's got to be something that guarantees that there's no hippo in the room right now. So it's not just the presence of other stuff. It has to be something like the absence of a hippo, a negative state of affairs, that there is no hippo here. Or alternatively, some kind of extra fact in the world that somehow takes into account what there is in the room and gives me back there being no hippo, like a totality state of affairs. That, the positive states of affairs about the room are all the states of affairs about the room. That was David Armstrong's take on it.
But you're not fond of that, or are you fond of the totalities?
Well, I've moved through different states of mind about these
states
things,
of affairs,
right? So when you're
in the mind,
right, yeah. Well, when you write on something, particularly when you write a journal article, it's almost like you have to get yourself in a mindset of being, you take a view, and the opposing views are your opposing views, and you have to be very like, this is wrong, this is right.
Yeah.
And over time, I mean, I wrote some stuff on that, and I think over time I've just become a lot more sanguine. There are a bunch of views. They all have advantages and disadvantages. I mean, one thing that doesn't strike me that's so great about the states of totality states of affairs is they just seem too broad, right? If there's a totality fact about this room saying that the facts about me and the camera and that are all the facts, then that one state of affairs, the totality state of affairs, makes it true that there's no rhino in here, that there's no hippo in here, that there's no cricket match happening in here. It makes true a whole bunch of stuff. And it seems reasonable to me to think that different propositions with completely different contents should be made true when they're made true by different things.
Yeah. But this would make like all negative truths here would be made true by the totality.
Yeah, depending. I mean, you might have different totality facts.
Okay.
You might not just have one. You might just have one totality fact for the whole world that says, look at all the facts in the world. That's it.
That's how I thought it was, but I made.
You can also have a totality fact for the facts about the room.
Okay. But
and a different totality fact for the facts about your room, and so you will get subtle differences in negative.
But the problem, as you mentioned it, is that it seems that let's take the totality of room facts. That would make it both true that there's no rhino in the room, and makes it true that there's no prime number in the room. Make it true that all these, but these have like wildly different contents, and then you want to say that they have different truth makers. Is that the worry, or?
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it seems like they should have different ones. A different way of putting that would be, if you want there to be some kind of relationship between potential truth makers and content, if they've got different contents, you're going to need potentially different things in the world to explicate that difference in content. It might be tricky to do that with totality facts.
Yeah.
It's not a super strong argument, but it's some motivation for going for more specific facts.
Yeah. So I want to go to one of your arguments, which you have published before I think this book came out, about the knowledge stuff, right?
Oh,
but
yeah.
So that's in the book,
yeah.
and it's an argument for why truth-making non-maximalism fails, about specifically kind of negative states of affairs, right? But
Yeah.
I suppose, I mean, essentially, this argument could be generalized for everything, right?
It's meant to be an argument for maximalism for any kind of proposition that you might think is tricky. Yeah, for sure.
But roughly, like, the problem is that, well, if you buy truth makers at all, you're gonna have to accept that, like, for any factive mental state, sort of like I know that, or like I'm seeing that, or whatever, like whatever you take it to be fact. But you talk about knowledge, but like, say for this factive mental state of knowing, we're gonna have to regard a positive fact that I know that there's no beer in the fridge. Say if there's no beer in the fridge, but then this, I mean, on any account of knowledge, this does entail that there's no beer in the fridge. So then we have this case here where we have a positive fact, a kind of uncontroversially maybe positive fact that entails a negative fact, and the worry is then how can you say that negative fact is not made true, or sorry, the negative fact is a well, I suppose, yeah, is it not? How can you say that's a negative fact when it's entailed by a positive fact? Or how would you formulate that?
I mean, the dialectic here gets a little bit tricky. So you have these. One theory is that, like, not all truths have a truth maker, but some do. There's the positive ones, there's the negative ones, and then there's, so I'm sitting has a truth maker. There's no rhino here, doesn't have a truth maker. It doesn't need one, and then maybe combinations of them are bit and bit. So either I'm sitting or there's a rhino. There's no rhino in here. That would be. It's neither positive nor negative. It gets its truth by looking at how OR works. So you might, broadly speaking, split up truths into three categories: need a truth maker, don't need a truth maker,
or
it depends on how they're made up. Okay, then the main worry for people who think that there is no rhino in this room has a truth maker is, well, what kind of entity could possibly do that job, right? What kind of entity could possibly exclude the existence of a rhino in the room? And then the argument against that view is well, take a case like, I know that there's no beer in the fridge. If that truth has a truth maker, then whatever that entity is excludes there being beer in the fridge. It necessarily excludes beer in the fridge because knowledge is factive. So we don't want to say, I mean, if you say that entity exists, I think you've given the game up, as in the truth maker opponents have given the game up because they've admitted that there are entities in the world that necessarily exclude the existence of other entities. Why not just say those entities are truth makers? Okay.
Yeah.
You also don't want to say that kind of state of affair, that kind of truth is negative. Like, you could know that there is no beer in the fridge. That could be true with no truth maker. Seems like it needs a truth maker. Your third option is to say that somehow the truth of I know that there are no beer in the fridge kind of depends on its constituents.
Yeah.
And I suppose this is the tricky step for me. But my thought was, okay, so if you're going to claim that the truth of I know that there's no beer in the fridge kind of relates somehow to other truths or other constituents of that proposition, give me some sense that proposition can be broken down into more basic propositions.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the way to say it is that you have belief and justification, maybe, or warrant and plus.
Yeah.
And you kind of leave it unspecified what the plus is, but you just have a thought that there has to be some way of formulating knowledge that is not kind of entail truth. Or there has to be some analysis of knowledge which you can break truth away from, at least. Yeah.
So there is a sort of a remnant of knowledge that is non-factive. So knowledge is kind of that thing plus truth. And that would do the trick, because then you have you could have a truth maker for the other bit, and then no truth maker for the factive bit, because we're assuming that there's no truth maker for, there's no beer in the fridge, and if we just if we assume that that's how propositions about knowing stuff work, then fine, no problem. So the question is it dialectically speaking? So I'm not saying that's impossible. I don't think I could give like an impossibility proof. It's more like which theory seems more reasonable. And the thought is just that any attempt to try and break down knowledge into something more basic has just gone horrendously wrong in the past. So maybe there's some way of breaking it out into simpler propositions out there. But it just doesn't look, there's been there was like in the 70s through to whenever, intensive efforts to try to analyze knowledge. And it all went pretty bad.
I mean, it seems like because you talk about this, and I suppose maybe tying on to a little bit what you were saying before about sort of algorithmic knowledge, sort of kind of generating new knowledge from premises that we have. Maybe that's not going to work because we don't know what premises we could use to kind of and get us to knowledge, like P is justified, P is true, so on. But I mean, in some sense, it just seems that it has to be the case that there's something like going on in my head. When I think, there's beer, there's no beer in the fridge. There's something going on in my mind, or maybe like broadly take into account certain parts of my environment too, if you want to be a bit externalist, but which is compatible with it not being the case that there is beer in the fridge. And then that kind of suggests that in principle, it has to be possible to separate a truth maker, a positive truth maker, for kind of the non-factive bit of I know that there's no beer in the fridge, but it's just, maybe it's not possible in practice. I don't know. That's my thought.
I totally agree that knowledge, as it the state of knowledge in our brains, is not a metaphysical primitive, right? We
okay.
To know something, it must depend on something more basic, more physical.
Yeah.
So it's more of a dialectical issue.
Yeah.
If a theorist wants to come along and say, here's how we understand truth without truth making, fine, I'm all good with that. But let's see the details.
Yeah, exactly. So even though, sorry, you go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's it. Really, it's more a case of like, who can get a theory on the table. Yeah,
I suppose that is the case, but
it might just come down to this is just occurring to me as you're kind of raising these issues, something of what we were talking about before about theoretical virtues, that perhaps adding some kind of principles to your theory that allows you to simplify the formulation of the theory is a reason for accepting that theory, and it might be that truth maker maximalism falls into that kind of camp, that we can give a simpler account of truth and content and things like that by just accepting truth making across the board, rather than having to massively complicate the issue by saying that some do and some don't.
That's true, yeah. But I suppose, and is it made true as well? I don't know. No, no. But I suppose the kind of rejoinder would be that, like, well, now I have to accept that there is some fact in the world that makes it the case that there's some entity in the world that makes it the case that there's no beer in the fridge, and that for some reason this appears unintuitive. And I wanted to ask you why, because, and this has broadly to do with my question earlier also about the distinction between a kind of entity-based, like Socrates makes it true that Socrates exists. Like this is Socrates is like an entity, a thing, right? Or was a thing, versus this kind of approach to say, well, like the existence of the state of affairs makes it the case that whatever. It's just that it seems that maybe the thing that is happening here is that when we talk about entities, people think about medium-sized dry goods, right? Or they think about a physical object, and then, or something very like a physical object. And then the thought is that if there are these entities that like make negative facts true, there has to be like, some object that is like is devoid of all being, that just comes in and like makes this. Yeah, I don't know. It has to be something about the way we kind of think about entities that makes you reluctant to accept that there are negative.
There's absolutely this conceptual resistance to think in those terms. I think that goes for a lot of things that metaphysicians talk about.
Yeah.
Even when they're just talking about, less weird entities than, say, negative facts. So when they talk about the statue and the clay being two rather than one, and there's conceptual resistance there because we just don't see the world in those terms. It's something that if you think that's the way the world is, you only come to realize it through reasoning.
Yeah. Right.
Not through investigation of the world. Empirical investigation. I mean, I think the thing with thinking about, to try and make this sort of view, the negative facts or whatever view, palatable, we need some softeners, and probably the best one is something like a ring donut, right? Mm-hmm. It's a material entity, but if it didn't have the hole in the middle, it wouldn't be the thing it is. So, kind of something about its identity as a material entity involves, the hole in the middle. If it didn't have the hole there, it wouldn't be a ring donut. How do we? And there's a whole, there's a whole literature on holes, trying to make sense of the notion without positing absences. And
but there's this kind of like weird thing that like you say positing absences, and in some way it's kind of like it's obviously true that there are absences in one sense of like what it means to be, right? It's obvious that there are absences. But then I think, I don't know if this is correct, but this is my thought about it, that what you're thinking is like there's an entity which is an absence that is in the middle of the donut. And that is kind of very hard to accept, because when you think about entities, you automatically think about medium-sized dry goods or something similar to them. Like you think that if something is an entity,
but I mean the hole in the middle of the donut is
part of it.
It's medium-sized and it's dry.
Or maybe it doesn't have dryness. Or
so this sort of softening up line tends to go down. Well, we start with things we know and love.
Yeah.
And then we kind of just sort of push the boundaries a little bit and say, well, if you accept that, then this, and then very similar to what how lots of metaphysicians think about other weird objects that form part of their ontologies.
Yeah.
So perhaps entities that have slightly weird modal profiles, or if you think about clouds in terms of not one vague object, but lots of different precise objects standing in some kind of relationship. So there's actually lots of objects where it looks like there's just one.
Yeah.
Or you think that whenever you've got a desk, you've actually got also a whole bunch of objects, like the left half and the right half, but we don't see the world like that.
Yeah.
It's very much this process of saying, okay, so if we accept this as a genuine object, then how about this? Oh, if not, why not? And just keep pushing it, until we end up with objects that initially we thought just no way do they exist. It's a kind of, in some ways, it's a kind of a Sorites. It's kind of a sort of
it's a bit like that.
Yeah.
Or
it's a Sorites, but a good argument. I want to say in this case,
exactly. I'm just kind of thinking because I was thinking that there's something about like very exciting about finding out that the cloud is composed by, you know, all of these precise objects. There's something exciting about it, and maybe the exciting part comes from thinking of entities in a kind of a substantial sense, right? That you think that, you know, to be an entity is to be this almost concrete thing, right? But then if you kind of, I mean, there's another sense of entity in which it's purely a logical thing. I mean, to be an entity is merely to be the referent of a term that figures in a true sentence or something like that. In which case, it's not as kind of exciting to find out.
Right. And then so maybe think
of
like fictional objects or something in those.
Exactly.
terms.
Yeah. And I mean, there's something also about fictional. Like, I learn. Of course, I know like Sherlock Holmes lives, you know, on Baker Street, whatever. But there's something exciting about finding out that like the world contains Sherlock Holmes, or exciting or frightening. I don't know.
Yeah, but if we found that out, it would be very kind of exciting.
Exactly. But then doesn't that? It seems that it relies on like the substantial notion of being an entity, and that like when I'm imagining this world which contains, you know, all the concrete things, maybe some abstract things, and also Sherlock Holmes, it's like Sherlock Holmes living in some realm somewhere, being almost like, you know, a spatially extended object. And then if I stretch what it means to be an entity in a kind of if I stretch it out too much, maybe would it be still exciting to think that there are negative, and maybe it's just like trivial that there are negative facts. Right? Because there is no beer in the fridge is a fact, right? And it's negative, right? So it's just trivial.
Yeah. So I suppose part of it is like whether we want to say it's in some ways purely logical or something like that. And I think I don't want to say that. I think I want to say that it's I mean, things like, you know, the hole in the donut, it's spatially located, it's temporally spatio-temporally located, let's say, has causal properties. So it can cause stuff, we can perceive it. So in that sense, it's got the same kind of properties as you know, regular spatio-temporal, you know, physical objects. They're gonna be different in other ways, in that they're not gonna, you know, they're not obviously gonna have sort of, they're not going to increase, you know, adding more of them isn't going to increase the mass of the stuff in the room. But you've already got issues of that if you think about, like, you know, the statue and the clay, right? To work out their combined mass, you don't add them together because they share their mass, as it were. So you already have a lot of these weird features if you believe in overlapping objects or you know, the plurality of objects in the same place at the same time. So absolutely there is weird stuff going on here, but I think it's just weirdness that is to some extent shared with other weird bits of metaphysics.
Yeah. And ultimately, as you say, I mean, it's not as if we haven't found out that the world was weird by kind of you know, looking at different theories of the world, and like, I mean, some might be more weird than others, but they might, you know, fare better on other metrics, and in which case, you know, now we believe in all sorts of weird stuff in physics. I think
all you want to locate your weirdness in the theories in between common sense and quantum physics. Like, you know, so if it's not as weird as quantum physics, but which we think of as being good physical theory, then I think it's within the realms of, you know, acceptable weirdness.
Right. Negative facts, when you say that they are, where would you put them on this line?
Well, I mean, I think it's easier to articulate a theory of them, to talk about determinate locations, to talk about causal properties, that kind of stuff. I think it's easier to talk about negative facts than it is about, you know,
that's true.
Quantum behavior, which, you know, it's just difficult in pretty much every respect.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we have to start wrapping up pretty soon, but I wanted to get to like I think in some sense you could say that this is the driving force of the book, and this comes pretty late, which is the work on paradoxes that you have, and you make a very interesting argument that by taking this truth-maker maximalism principle, not only truth-maker maximalism, but also this identification of is true, the property being true, and the property being made true, we can solve the liar paradox and also adjacent paradoxes like the Curry paradox. And I wanted so could you say why that is? And I have one question about it, and then we could.
I'll run you through the idea. Yeah. On the issue of how important it is, I don't know. I don't know whether this is like a nice little bit, if it works, is it like super important? Is it a motivating argument? Is it a bit of icing on the cake? I really don't know. I included that in the book because often when you talk about truth to philosophers, you go down one of two paths. Exactly. Either you're talking about metaphysics or you're talking about logic. And if you talk about logic, it's just paradox. And if you talk about metaphysics, you ignore paradox. And I wanted to just sort of, I like both fields, and I like fields talking together. So I just wanted to kind of try and include both things. But how important the bit on paradox is. I mean, at least
argument, I don't know. I mean, for me, it seemed that, and I was reading some reviews of the book as well, that I think it is pretty important in the sense that, like, I mean, there's a lot of like heavy metaphysical baggage going on here, and as you say, you can't accept craziness or weirdness, but you have to do it in some, if there's justification for it. And I think that if this argument of yours succeeds, then that would provide good reasons for this approach to truth.
Sure,
and maybe it would kind of also kind of tie down. I mean, I think because it kind of ties down the metaphysics in some way to logical considerations, and maybe that's good in itself. So I thought it was. I thought it was pretty. I mean, when I read the book, it felt like it was doing some heavy lifting, but I don't know if that's
all right. Well, let's go through it. So this part of the book, it's not just the idea that you've got truth understood in terms of truth making. It's also the idea that we're going to understand content, propositions or whatever, in terms of the possible truth maker. Right. So the proposition that it's raining or whatever is given by it's the set of all the possible truth makers for that sentence. So that's a general theory of content of propositions, and then you say, okay, well let's look at a content like something paradoxical like the liar sentence. What content does that express? Well, we would have to find all its possible truth makers, but there aren't any, so there is no content there. That's the initial step, right? So you've got a general account of content. Then you've got, oh, look, in the case of the liar, this doesn't give us a proposition, so there's no liar proposition. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for thinking about the liar as a problem? So that the sentence, this sentence is not true. Well, the idea is, I mean, and this is something that lots of people have tried. Yeah. And in some ways, it's a very flat-footed response to the liar. It's just the idea that there is no content there to be evaluated in the first place. Yeah. So some people have expressed this by saying the sentence is somehow badly formed. That doesn't really work. Or by saying somehow it's not meaningful. I mean, I think that line's hard because all the words are meaningful. Yeah. It's well formed. But the idea is we have a principled reason for saying that there is no liar proposition, because we've got a general theory of propositions which tells us that in the case of this particular sentence, no proposition. Why might that be a good way of responding to the liar paradox? Well, generally, we know that the issue is not just solving the specific, sentence, this sentence is not true, but it's also revenge, right? Yeah. So you might go, oh, well, if the sentence is not true and the sentence says that it's not true, then it is true. Back into the paradox. That's a bit of kind of informal reasoning about it. But the idea is we're saying that the sentence isn't true, but it says of itself that it is true, that it isn't true. And the idea there is, well, if the sentence can't say that unless it expresses a certain content, that, you know, for a sentence to say something is a hand-wavy way of saying it expresses a certain content, and that content is the content that blah, 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 blah. And that's what we're saying doesn't happen in this case. There is no content being expressed by that sentence that could come back into revenge-style reasoning.
But that's
basically it.
That's the strategy. And you say that the liar paradox, the liar sentence is meaningful. So that's...
It's meaningful in the sense that you've got a bunch of contentful phrases put together in a grammatical way.
Right, but it's not meaningful in the sense that it's truth apt, because only propositions are truth apt.
Yeah.
And
so we've got a bunch of meaningful, you know, subsentential components put together in a grammatical way that just so happens not to generate a truth apt content.
Right, and the worry with the revenge paradoxes, which, I mean, to be clear, is like, well, I mean, if you say, you know, the liar paradox the liar sentence is meaningless, then I can just formulate a new one saying, like, this sentence is not true. And in which case, you know, if it is true,
if it's not meaningful, it's not
exactly,
true. So it should,
And the differentiating feature of your view is that that kind of claim, this proposition is not true, is not even going to be a proposition. So you can't say that it is. So even if I grant that, okay, that proposition is not true, I'm not going to be able to infer that it is true.
Yeah.
Because there's no content for
objects that you can infer something about.
Yeah. I mean, like, have other people said, like, to the revenge paradox, it's just avoiding propositions and truth makers? Like, have people said similar things there as well, that you couldn't infer from the sentence, like, this sentence is not true, that it is true because it's just meaningless?
The literature on the liar is very much taken up with logics of truth, where we deal almost exclusively in sentences and inferences between sentences. So this kind of solution, or this kind of attempt at a solution, is kind of, it feels a bit orthogonal to those kind of concerns, because, you know, I'm allowing that there's a liar sentence, you know, of course there is, but I'm working at the level of propositions and trying to solve it at a slightly different level. So I suppose what a lot of people are going to be, what they're going to say is, okay, great, you say there's no proposition here, but what is then the logic of sentences? Yeah, that's like, what can we infer from the liar sentence? And I mean, again, I've got a bit of a sort of a flat-footed response that is, logic concerns truth, and truth concerns propositions. So
yeah, exactly.
Logic is, in the first instance, it concerns relationships between propositions, and we write that down with sentences, right? It's the only option we've got to write down logic using sentences, and it's just a background assumption that all the sentences that we've got express propositions, right? So we if you do truth functional logic, you write down P and Q and R, and you say all of these things express propositions, and all of it works absolutely fine until you've got enough vocabulary that you can write down strings that then don't express propositions, like the liar.
Right.
And I think it's going to be a consequence of the sort of line that I'm trying to take here, that you can't really give a theory of when things will go right and when things will go wrong. As in, you can't write down you can't write down a theory of when sentences express propositions that in a complete way, because if you did, I think you would be able to get revenge paradoxes. So take the sentence like, this sentence doesn't express a proposition, or some variant of that, right?
Yeah.
I think you would get revenge type paradoxes if you tried to formulate those kind of concepts.
But I mean, isn't a thought here as well that, like, if you identify being true with being made true, then a kind of an easy step in this argument is like, Well, I mean, take the revenge sentence again. So this sentence is not true. If we suppose that it is not true, then it is true, right? That's like a kind of a very, very, very like basic move. But that if you identify truth with being made true, that doesn't follow, right? You can't infer from just any meaningful declarative sentence that if it holds, then it is true, because it may fail to be. It may be meaningful, as in the case of the liar, but fail to be truth apt in the strong sense, right? So would you say that's the kind of the move here, that like a revenge paradox is just blocked because they're not going to be made true by anything, by the standards you have set up?
Well, that's putting it that way makes it sound very close to a kind of Kripke style theory of truth, right? Where you have true, you have like clear truth, clear false, and then you have these kind of ungrounded sentences. And it's meant to be a problem for a Kripke style theory that of the sentences that fall in the middle, the ungrounded ones, you say, oh, this sentence, the liar, it's ungrounded, therefore it's not true, but it's the sentence that says of itself that it's not true. So it looks like you have this kind of meta-language kind of issue. And I think what's going on there is you have this thing that you can point at. Yeah. Right, the sentence. And we've got a theory of the semantics of sentences. They're either true or false or ungrounded. And we can reason. Is it true? Is it false? Is it ungrounded? Well, it's ungrounded, so it's not one of the other ones, but it says that it's not one of the other ones. So that's the kind of revenge problem you get for Kripke. Because we've got these entities, sentences, and we've got this theory of how they work. I guess the line I'm going for is we have a theory of propositions, but in the liar case, we don't have a proposition that we can point at and reason about.
Yeah, that's how I understood it as well.
We do have a theory of sentences that we can reason with. I mean, obviously, the sentence P and Q implies the sentence P. That works in all cases where those sentences express propositions. What we don't have is a complete theory of reasoning for sentences,
right? And
in a language where you've got full logic and you've got the rules of truth,
and for reasoning from sentences to exactly which like express propositions and not. Would that be?
Yeah. We don't. Yeah. If you bundled into that theory of sentences also the cases in which the sentences express propositions, then what effectively you do is you would lift up the theory of propositions to the theory of sentences. You would embed one in the other.
Yeah.
And then you're just back to the problem of like classical logic, rules of truth, liar paradox, boom, problem.
Yeah. But I shall say, I mean, before we end, that, I mean, regardless of, I suppose, there's much more to be said about this, but I think I really kind of found it reasonable that something about the liar and the truth sayer as well, which is the sentence, this sentence is true, and about Curry's paradox, which is like the claim that if this sentence is true, then, whatever, and then you can use that and derive that whatever follows. These have a similarity in that both seem to be as I think Dummett put it, like barely true. Like they're just, like if they're true, they're just true, but there's nothing that can like ground them. Like there's nothing in the world that could make them true. They're just kind of self-encapsulated truths in some way. And that if you take a truth-making approach to what truth is, then it seems that you have a kind of a principled way to avoid those bare truths, because you just said the truth cannot be bare,
That's
bare truth.
kind of the original thought that, taking this like tough relationship between like truth really requiring the world to do some work, taking that seriously should, that sort of metaphysical thought should have something to say about these kind of logical problems about truths like, propositions or sentences like the ones you were just mentioning.
Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, there's much more to be said about it. Perhaps, the truth maker approach isn't going to solve the paradox. But on the other hand, I mean, if the truth maker approach is I mean, the truth-maker approach, as you say, does seem to lend itself towards a kind of an approach to these problems all at once, these kind of sentences, because they all appear to be non-grounded truths, or kind of like not in Kripke's sense, but I mean, like, they're not.
But in some sense,
self-encapsulated truths that kind of strip that they kind of lift themselves up by the bootstrap and make themselves true. But there's nothing kind of.
I mean, I'll take. What did you say? Like, it's kind of plausible, or I'll take that, right? Because every attempt to solve the liar is just looks really incredible.
Yeah.
And pretty much every solution on the market seems to ask a lot of us, and most of them seem to have, real problems. So just having something that's kind of halfway plausible, I think, is a pretty good result in this case.
Yeah.
These are hard paradoxes, yeah.
Very, very much so, yeah. But I think, I mean, to end this conversation, I mean, I must say that I think the book is really good. Like, you should, like, to those listening to this who've made it all the way through, if anyone in the world, if there's a truth maker for that proposition, then I think if you made it through, then you should definitely go check out the book, because I think that it's very clearly written, it's very easily understood, and it covers so much terrain, and it has a lot of, like, spicy hot takes, which is very fun to read, which are, I mean, not just, I mean, which are, have good motivations as well. So it was, a very nice read, and very nice to talk to you as well. And thank you for answering.
Thanks. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the chat, and it's just fantastic when somebody out there it reads what you've written and thinks about it and wants to ask you questions about it. So I've really enjoyed the chat. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Very nice. Yeah.
Content Podcast, a philosophy podcast about articles and books in metaphysics, meta-metaphysics, meta-meta-metaphysics, meta-meta-meta-metaphysics, and meta-meta-meta-meta-metaphysics, but also adjacent areas. Hope you enjoy the content. If you do, be sure to smash that citation button.